"Let go of the dress, old woman. It's as dead as this theatre." The voice was cold sharp, and laced with the casual cruelty of a man unaccustomed to being denied anything. In the dusty forgotten workshop beneath the grand stage, Julian Croft stood over the magnificent decaying gown, his expensive suit a dark slash in the warm lamplight. No, Isabel's reply was a desperate whisper, her hands shielding the fragile silk as if protecting a living thing. "You don't understand what you're doing." In the brief, tense struggle that followed, a sickening tear echoed in the silence. From a hidden pocket in the lining, a small wooden box tumbled out, landing, with a lonely clatter on the floorboards. It wasn't just a box. It was a tomb holding a 30-year-old secret, a key that would unlock a lifetime of lies and rewrite the fate of the very man who had just broken it. What earth-shattering secret was sealed inside, and why did it have the power to bring a ruthless tycoon to his knees? If you believe some legacies are worth fighting for, click the subscribe button as we uncover the truth right now. The black sedan cut through the afternoon haze of the city, a shard of obsidian against the warm, honeyed tones of the brownstones. It didn't belong here, not on this street, where history was a currency more valuable than the gold-plated logos on the newer, brasher avenues. The car whispered to a stop before the majestic Palace Theatre, its engine a low, predatory hum that seemed to mock the building's quiet dignity. Julian Croft stepped out. He was a man tailored in shades of grey, a charcoal suit that cost more than the theatre's monthly payroll, slate-grey eyes that held the cold, flat light of a winter sky, and a presence that seemed to suck the very warmth from the air around him. He did not see the grand Beaux-Arts facade with its cherubs worn smooth by a century of acid rain. He did not see the ghosts of 1,000 opening nights clinging to the marble columns. He saw a location, an asset, a 1.5-acre plot of prime, underperforming real estate. He pushed open the immense wrought iron gate. It groaned a deep, mournful sound of protest that echoed in the sudden quiet of the grand lobby. Julian didn't notice. He was already calculating the cost of demolition versus the projected revenue from the 40-story glass and steel monolith he planned to erect in its place. A temple of commerce to replace this cathedral of dust. His mentor and chief advisor, Lawrence Hayes, followed a step behind him, a silver-haired shadow in an equally expensive suit. Lawrence's smile was a well-practiced instrument of reassurance. "A magnificent footprint, Julian," he murmured, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "The location is unmatched." Julian grunted in agreement, his gaze sweeping over the cavernous space. The lobby was a symphony of faded grandeur. A twin staircase of carved mahogany swept upwards into the shadows, its banister polished to a dark sheen by the hands of generations. High above a crystal chandelier, immense and intricate, hung like a frozen firework, its prisms coated in a fine grey film. "It's a relic," Julian said, his voice sharp, devoid of sentiment. "A beautiful, inefficient, and utterly obsolete relic." The meeting took place an hour later, in what was once the founder's study, a room panelled in dark wood that smelled of old paper and regret. The theatre's small, beleaguered management team sat around the heavy table, their faces a mixture of apprehension and forced optimism. They spoke of revival plans, of community outreach, of the new season they hoped to stage. Julian let them talk his face, an unreadable mask, his fingers steepled before him. He was a hawk listening to the flutter of sparrows. When they had finished, a hopeful silence filled the room. Julian let it hang there for a beat, a small, cruel exercise of power. "Thank you for your passion," he began the word, tasting like ash in his mouth. "But let's be clear. My firm did not acquire the majestic palace to sell tickets to another production of A Christmas Carol. We acquired it for the land it sits on. The blood drained from the faces around the table. This theatre, Julian continued his voice, as precise and unforgiving as a surgeon's scalpel, has been hemorrhaging money for 3 years. For 3 years it has failed to justify its own existence on a purely financial basis. It is by every metric that matters a failure. Lawrence nodded sagely beside him. A difficult truth, but a necessary one. Business is not about sentiment, it's about evolution. Julian leaned forward, his cold eyes pinning each manager in place. My team has already drafted the plans. A state-of-the-art commercial complex. Retail on the ground floor, premium office space, above luxury condos in the spire. It will be a monument to profitability. A beacon of modern commerce. He gestured dismissively at the room around them. We'll be replacing this nostalgic mess with a clean, profitable glass tower. The situational irony was lost on him, but the faint, bitter taste of it seemed to hang in the air. A young woman from marketing started to speak, her voice trembling slightly. But the history, the architecture. History doesn't pay dividends, Julian cut her off, and the architecture is a thermal efficiency nightmare. The demolition permits will be filed by the end of the month. It was then that the door at the far end of the study opened without a sound. A figure had been standing there in the shadows of the hallway, a silent observer to the execution. As she stepped into the light, she seemed to bring the weight of the entire theatre with her. She was an old woman, perhaps in her late 60s, with skin the color of rich, dark earth and eyes that held a knowing, unyielding light. Her silver hair was pulled back in a simple, elegant bun, and she wore a plain, dark dress, its collar adorned with a simple, antique silver pin. Her hands clasped before her were not the frail, delicate hands of an old woman. They were strong, capable with the telltale calluses of someone who had worked with a needle and thread for a lifetime. This was Isabel, the theatre's head of costumes, a permanent fixture who had been there longer than anyone, a living part of the building's memory. She walked directly to the table, her gaze fixed not on Lawrence or the terrified managers, but on Julian. There was no fear in her eyes, only a profound, unshakable certainty. Lawrence, ever the diplomat, cleared his throat. Isabel, this is a private meeting. She ignored him. Her eyes never left Julian's. I heard what you said. She said, her voice quiet, yet it commanded the attention of the entire room. It was a voice that had calmed panicked actors and directed frantic stagehands, a voice laced with the authority of decades. You speak of this place as if it were a ledger of profits and losses. Julian, unused to being addressed so directly by someone he considered staff, raised a single arrogant eyebrow. I speak of it as what it is. A business. Isabel gave a slow, deliberate shake of her head. No, she said softly. It is a vessel. It holds the echoes of every line ever spoken on its stage, the memory of every tear shed in its seats, the soul of every artist who ever poured their heart out under these lights. A flicker of annoyance crossed Julian's face. He had no time for this theatrical poetry. That's all very charming, but, as I said, sentimentality doesn't. You can own the bricks. She interrupted, her quiet voice slicing through his condescension with effortless precision. You can own the land. You can hold the deed in your hand. She took a step closer, her dark eyes locking with his. The room held its breath. But you, Mr. Croft, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow louder than a shout, will never own its soul. Some ghosts are made of memory and thread. That night, Julian returned to the theatre. He told himself it was a practical matter, a final survey of the asset before the engineers arrived at dawn. but as the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind him, sealing him inside with the profound weighted silence, he knew it was a lie. Her words, Isabel's words, had burrowed under his skin like splinters of glass. "You will never own its soul." An absurd theatrical statement. And yet it had followed him from the boardroom, clung to him in the sterile quiet of his sedan, and echoed in the minimalist expanse of his penthouse. He stood alone in the center of the grand lobby, without the daytime bustle of his team and the nervous energy of the theater staff. The space felt impossibly vast. The city's ambient glow filtered through the towering Palladian windows, turning the dust motes into a swirling galaxy of silver. The air was thick with the scent of old velvet lemon polish and something else, something intangible he couldn't name. The scent of anticipation. He ran a hand along the cool, smooth marble of the staircase, feeling the slight dip in the stone where millions of hands had gripped it before him. For the first time, he felt the building not as a structure, but as a witness. Driven by an impulse he didn't care to analyze, he bypassed the main auditorium and sought the unseen corners of the building. He took a narrow staircase down the air growing cooler, the scent changing from polished grandeur to earthy decay. He was in the labyrinth beneath the stage, a world of raw brick and exposed pipes that snaked through the darkness like ancient tree roots. This was the theater's underbelly, its functional, unglamorous heart. A single sliver of warm light bled from beneath a heavy wooden door at the end of a long corridor. It was the only sign of life in the entire subterranean maze. He approached silently, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the dusty concrete floor. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. He had stepped into another time. The room was a chaotic sanctuary of creation. Mannequins stood like a silent chorus line, draped in the gossamer ghosts of past productions. Bolts of fabric, silk satin brocade, were stacked to the ceiling, a library of color and texture. The walls were covered in faded sketches, costume designs with notes scribbled in elegant spidery script. And in the center of it, all bathed in the warm glow of a single low-hanging lamp, sat Isabel. She didn't look up. Her focus was absolute, her hands moving with a fluid, practiced grace that was mesmerizing to watch. She was hunched over a dress spread across a massive work table. It was a magnificent creation, a ball gown of deep emerald silk with a bodice encrusted in beads that must have once glittered like a king's ransom. But it was old. The silk was fragile, the beading had grown dull, and there were tears in the delicate lace of the sleeves. Isabel was not merely mending it. She was breathing life back into it, one meticulous stitch at a time. The only sound in the room was the whisper-soft shh of her needle piercing the ancient fabric. Julian watched for a full minute before he spoke, and when he did, his voice was a harsh intrusion in the sacred quiet. "What is this place?" Isabel finished her stitch, knotted the thread, and snipped it with a small pair of silver scissors before she finally looked up at him. Her eyes in the warm lamplight were deep and clear. "This is the workshop," she said simply. "It's where the magic is made." He stepped further into the room, his gaze falling on the decaying gown. That dress. It's seen better days. Why are you wasting your time on it? The entire building is coming down. Isabel looked from Julian's dismissive face back to the gown, her expression softening, with a tenderness that baffled him. "Some things, Mr. Croft, are not disposable. They hold memories." She gently touched a cluster of tarnished beads on the bodice. "This one holds more than most." The cryptic response grated on him. It was the same sentimental nonsense from the boardroom. "Memories don't have a market value," he said the words sharp. "This is a waste of resources, of time." She finally set her needle down and folded her hands over the silk, regarding him with a look that was not unkind, but held a hint of pity that he found deeply insulting. "You are correct, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice still quiet, but now laced with a fine, sharp thread of irony. "Some things are priceless. It is a difficult concept for a man who deals only in prices." The subtle rebuke stung more than an open insult. He felt a flush of anger. She was just an employee, an old woman clinging to a past that was about to be bulldozed into oblivion. She was an obstacle. And yet he couldn't simply dismiss her. There was a formidable strength in her stillness, a deep-rooted power that his wealth and authority seemed unable to touch. "This theatre is a business in failure," he stated, falling back on the certainty of numbers. "My plan will create hundreds of jobs and generate millions in tax revenue. It's progress. You can't stand in the way of that." Isabel picked up her needle again. "There is a difference between building something new and destroying something beautiful to do it." She looked at him one last time, her gaze direct and unwavering. "You see, the problem with men who only build with glass and steel is that they forget that you cannot see your own reflection in a pile of rubble." He had no answer for that. He stood there for another moment, feeling strangely out of place in this room full of memories and ghosts. He was the one with all the power, the one who held the building's fate in his hands. Yet in this small, cluttered basement, he felt like an intruder. He turned and left without another word, the sound of his footsteps echoing down the dark corridor, leaving Isabel alone once more, with her needle, her thread, and the secrets she was stitching back into the heart of the majestic palace. He came to conquer, but the walls fought back. The next morning, the theatre was no longer a silent sanctuary. It was an occupied territory. Julian arrived with his vanguard, a team of 6 architects and structural engineers, their crisp white hard hats and neon safety vests a jarring slash of modernity against the theatre's aged velvet and gold leaf. They moved with an invasive efficiency, their voices sharp and clinical, as they unrolled blueprints and set up laser measuring devices that cast sterile red lines across the ornate plasterwork. Julian stood at the center of the lobby, hands on his hips, a general surveying the battlefield before the first volley. Today, the building's soul would be mapped, measured, and condemned. Lawrence Hayes was at his side, radiating a sense of vicarious power. "A clean, decisive start, Julian," he said, with an approving nod. "No room for sentiment. I like it." The first sign of trouble came less than an hour in. Henderson, the lead engineer, a burly, no-nonsense man whose life was governed by the laws of physics and municipal codes, approached Julian with a frown creasing his brow. He held a tablet displaying a 3D scan overlaid on an old blueprint. The 2 images refused to align. "We have a problem," Mr. Croft, Henderson said, tapping the screen. "The original blueprints from 1928 are, let's call them, aspirational. The east wing's load-bearing columns aren't where they're supposed to be. And there's a sub-basement here." He pointed to a pulsing red area on the scan that doesn't exist on any official record. Julian's jaw tightened. "A clerical error. This is more than a clerical error. It's like someone built a ship inside a bottle, and we only have the plans for the bottle." As if summoned by the mention of secrets, she appeared. Isabel emerged from a dim side corridor, not alone this time, but flanked by 2 men who looked as much a part of the theatre as the brick and mortar. One was a wiry old man with a face like a road map, and hands stained with the ghosts of 1,000 different colors of paint, the props master. The other was a stooped but still powerful figure who squinted at the modern lighting rigs as if they were a personal affront, the head electrician who had been here for 50 years. They did not come to protest. They came to help. Isabel walked over to Henderson and peered at his tablet, her expression one of mild interest. "Ah, yes," she said, her voice calm amidst the engineer's frustrated murmurs. "The Phantom basement. That would be where the founder stored the pyrotechnics for the vaudeville acts. The city made him seal it off after the sparkler incident of '33. The entrance is behind the old orchestra pit's rear wall. You'll need a sledgehammer and a great deal of patience." Henderson stared at her dumbfounded. He was a man of data and schematics, and this old woman was speaking a language of forgotten history and oral tradition. Later, another engineer called Julian over to the proscenium arch. "The structural integrity here is a mess," the young man complained, pointing his laser at the intricate plasterwork. "It's been patched and reinforced so many times we can't get a clear reading on the original steel supports." The old electrician shuffled forward. "That's because half of it isn't steel." He rasped, his voice gravelly from decades of breathing in dust and solder. After the fire in '52, they couldn't get enough steel from the mills, so the founder he bought the truss from a decommissioned naval destroyer. It's battleship-grade armor plate up there. Good luck cutting through that with your standard torch. Everywhere Julian's team turned, they were met with another story, another secret, another layer of history that defied their modern tools and tidy plans. The building wasn't a simple structure. It was a living organism, a coral reef of additions, repairs, and secrets built one upon the other over a century. And Isabel and her quiet cohort were its librarians, offering up maddening unwritten truths that brought the methodical process of demolition planning to a grinding halt. Julian's frustration was mounting. He felt his control, his absolute authority, being subtly eroded not by rebellion, but by whispers. Lawrence, sensing his protégé's rising anger, drew him aside, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. His voice was a low, conspiratorial murmur. "Julian, you can't listen to them. They're part of the decay. Their stories are the chains holding this asset back from its true potential." He gestured toward Isabel, who was now quietly explaining to an architect why the auditorium's floor had a peculiar, almost imperceptible slope. "She's a relic, just like this building," Lawrence said, with a dismissive wave of his hand. "You need to be ruthless. That's the quality I always saw in you, the one that sets you apart. Demolish the past to build the future." He smiled, the picture of a wise mentor. "Don't let these sentimental dust bunnies get in your way. Bring in the heavy equipment. Let the hammers do the talking." The advice settled in Julian's mind, a cold, hard stone of logic. Lawrence was right. This was business. He was letting emotion, annoyance, frustration, cloud his judgment. He turned back to his team, his expression hardening. "Ignore them," he commanded, his voice cutting across the cavernous space. "If you encounter a discrepancy, mark it for demolition. We'll deal with the consequences as they come. I want a preliminary demolition schedule on my desk by 5 o'clock. The engineers looked uneasy, but they nodded. The order had been given. As his team resumed their work with a new, more forceful resolve, Julian caught Isabel's eye from across the room. She was no longer looking at him with pity or irony. Her gaze was steady, sorrowful, and deeply disappointed. It was the look of someone watching a man choose to break something beautiful, not because he had to, but because he couldn't be bothered to understand it. And in that moment, for the first time, Julian felt a sliver of doubt, a hairline fracture in the cold, sterile logic of his ambition. He was a conqueror, but for the first time, he felt as if the very walls were fighting back. A photograph holds a truth the mind forgets. By the third day, the theatre's quiet resistance had begun to feel like a personal assault on Julian's authority. The engineers' reports were a litany of frustrations, phantom walls, undocumented reinforcements, entire sections of the building that behaved as if the laws of physics were merely gentle suggestions. Progress was a crawl. Each delay was a small victory for the building's ghosts, and with every victory, Julian felt his own frustration solidifying into a cold, hard knot in his gut. He was a man who commanded cities to bend to his will, yet he was being thwarted by whispers and dust. He blamed the blueprints. The city archives had provided copies, but they were clearly incomplete, flawed. The master plans, the original architectural drawings, had to be somewhere in the building itself. He would find them. He would impose order on this chaos himself. Dismissing his team for an early lunch, Julian began his own search. He bypassed the main floors, the domains of performance and administration, and ascended a narrow, winding staircase tucked away behind the main balcony. It led to the upper floors, a warren of forgotten offices and storage rooms that hadn't seen a visitor in decades. The air up here was different, still and dry, thick with the scent of brittle paper and decaying leather. Sunlight struggled through grime-caked windows, illuminating the space in hazy cathedral-like shafts where dust motes spun like tiny silent planets. He moved from room to room, his footsteps echoing in the oppressive quiet. He pulled open the drawers of old metal filing cabinets, finding only brittle folders of ancient contracts and invoices that crumbled at his touch. This wasn't a search. It was an archaeological dig, and he was losing patience. Then he saw it. At the end of a long, dark corridor, there was a door that was different from the others. It was not a flimsy office door, but a heavy slab of solid oak with a tarnished brass knob and a keyhole clogged with the debris of years. It was locked. This felt less like a door and more like a seal. A gate. His first impulse was to call Henderson and have it forced open. But something held him back. A flicker of an emotion. He rarely indulged curiosity. In the top drawer of a rickety desk nearby, he found a heavy ring of ornate iron keys. He tried them one by one. The first 3 failed. The 4th scraped, resisted, and then, with a deep, resonant click that echoed down the hall, the old lock turned. The room within was a perfectly preserved moment in time. It was the founder's original office. A massive mahogany desk dominated the space, a silent sleeping giant. On the wall hung framed awards and yellowed newspaper clippings, celebrating long-forgotten triumphs. But it was the boxes stacked in the corner that drew him. They were filled with photographs. He began sifting through them, his movements, efficient, almost dismissive. He was looking for blueprints for schematics. He scanned past black and white images of smiling casts of opening night parties, of men in top hats and women in flapper dresses. It was a visual history of the very sentimentality he despised. He was about to close the last box when his eyes caught on a large 8x10 publicity shot set apart from the others. He picked it up. The world around him seemed to recede. It was a studio portrait of a young woman. Her beauty was incandescent, a brilliant light captured in monochrome. She had luminous, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold both a boundless joy and a profound, secret sorrow. But it wasn't just her beauty that transfixed him. It was her face, the elegant line of her jaw, the slight, almost imperceptible curve of her smile. It was a face he felt he knew, a face that resonated in a place deeper than memory. It was an echo in his own bones. He stood there for a long time, the photograph in his hand, a strange and unwelcome ache blooming in his chest. He found Lawrence in the main lobby looking insufferably pleased with himself as he reviewed the day's meager progress on his tablet. Julian walked straight to him, holding out the photograph. The urgency in his own voice surprised him. "Lawrence? Who is this?" Lawrence glanced at the photo, his interest fleeting. He gave a small, condescending chuckle. That's a ghost from the past. Ilara Vance. She was the star of this place for a time. Had the whole city in the palm of her hand back in the early 90s. What happened to her? Julian asked, his eyes still locked on the woman's face. Lawrence shrugged, a gesture of supreme indifference. He didn't even look at the photo again. Burned bright, burned out. It's a common story in this business. All heart, no head for the real world. She left Broadway vanished without a trace. Tragic, really. The casual way he spoke, the utter lack of reverence for the brilliant life captured in the image, was jarring. To Lawrence, this woman, this star, was just another failed asset, another forgotten line item in the theatre's long history of financial mismanagement. Julian looked from Lawrence's smug, untroubled face back to the hauntingly familiar eyes in the photograph. A cold unease began to creep up his spine. For the first time, he wasn't looking at his wise, pragmatic mentor. He was looking at a man who seemed a little too eager to bury the past, a little too comfortable erasing a person from history. And he was struck by a sudden, chilling question. Why? A single thread can unravel a lifetime of lies. Julian didn't sleep. The photograph of Ilara Vance sat on the nightstand of his sterile, minimalist apartment, a stark and vibrant accusation in a room devoid of personal history. Her eyes followed him. He tried to work, pulling up financial models and demolition projections on his laptop, but the numbers blurred into her face. The cold, hard logic that had governed his entire life was failing him, replaced by a chaotic, insistent hum of a question he couldn't form, but felt in his blood and his bones. Who was she? And why did looking at her feel like looking at a reflection of a soul he never knew he had? He gave up on work. By dawn, he was back in his car, speeding through the waking city, the photograph lying on the passenger seat beside him. He wasn't an investor visiting an asset anymore. He was a man possessed by a ghost, and he knew with an instinct that defied all reason that the only person who could perform the exorcism was the old woman in the basement. He found her exactly where he had left her, in the soft pool of light in the workshop, her needle still dancing over the emerald silk gown. The air of quiet sanctity that had once felt alien to him now felt like the very thing he was desperate to breach. He didn't bother with greetings. He strode to the work table and placed the photograph directly beside the dress. The two images, the vibrant living woman in monochrome and the magnificent aging gown, were a perfect heartbreaking match. This dress, Julian said, his voice tight-strained. It was hers, wasn't it, Ilara Vance's? Isabel looked from the photograph to his face, and for the first time he saw not just sorrow in her eyes, but a deep, guarded fear. She slowly set her needle down. Some things are better left in the past, Mr. Croft. The past is a luxury I can no longer afford. He shot back his frustration, making his words sharp. I need to know. Why is this dress so important? Why are you protecting it like some holy relic? Because it is, she replied, her voice barely a whisper. She stood then, a small but immovable figure, placing herself between him and the gown. It was the gesture of a guardian protecting a tomb. It holds a life, a promise, and a great deal of pain. It is not for you. Her refusal was a spark on dry tinder. The neat, orderly world inside his head was fracturing, and her quiet defiance was pushing him to the edge. Everything in this building is for me. I bought it. I own it. And I own this pile of old silk and tarnished beads. He reached for the dress, an impulsive, desperate gesture. He didn't mean to harm it. He just needed to touch it, to feel a tangible connection to the mystery that was consuming him. Just let me see it, no." Isabel's voice was suddenly fierce. She grabbed his wrist with a surprising strength, her work-worn fingers digging into his skin. "You will not defile this." For a moment they were locked in a silent struggle. The ruthless young tycoon and the steadfast old guardian, fighting over the soul of a dress. Julian pulled his arm back, and in the clumsy, angry movement, the sleeve of his suit jacket caught on a loose decorative thread on the gown's bodice. Rah! Rip! The sound was shockingly loud in the quiet room. It was not the sound of simple fabric tearing. It was the sound of something ancient and fragile finally giving way. A 4-inch seam on the gown's inner lining pulled apart. They both froze, staring at the wound in the silk. And from the tear, something small and dark tumbled out, landing on the dusty floor with a soft, definitive thud. It was a small wooden box, no bigger than his palm, inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Its wood was dark with age. Julian's breath caught in his throat. He looked at Isabel. Her face had crumpled, the fight gone from her, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated anguish. Her hand went to her mouth. "I tried to protect you," she whispered, the words choked with tears. "I promised her I would protect you from this." His hands trembling, Julian knelt and picked up the box. The clasp was old and stiff, but it opened under his thumb. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded yellowed velvet, lay 2 items. The first was a folded piece of paper, brittle with age. A birth certificate. He unfolded it. His own name stared back at him, Julian Croft. But it was the line above it that made the world tilt on its axis. Mother's name, Elara Vance Croft. He read it again. And again. The name from the photograph. The name Lawrence had dismissed with such casual contempt. A roaring began in his ears. He fumbled for the second item in the box. It was a letter, a stack of thin airmail-style pages covered in an elegant looping script. The ink was faded to a pale blue. "My dearest Julian," it began. "If you are reading this, then the world has not been as kind as I had prayed it would be. And Isabel, my dearest friend, has finally broken her promise. Forgive her. She only ever wanted to shield you from the truth that broke me. I don't know what you've been told about me. Perhaps that I was a flighty actress who ran away. Perhaps nothing at all. But I want you to know I did not leave you. I was sent away. This theater, it was my home. It was my father's dream. When he died, he left it to me. But I was an artist, not a businesswoman. I trusted a man to help me manage it, a man who had been my father's protégé, a man named Lawrence Hayes. Julian's heart stopped. He felt the air leave his lungs in a painful rush. He saw my love for this place, not as a strength, but as a weakness to be exploited. He told me the theater was failing, that my passion was bankrupting it. He isolated me, manipulated the books, and convinced me that the only way to save my father's legacy was to sign over control to him and disappear. He said my reputation was a liability. He made me believe I was the poison killing my own home. The hardest part was you. You were only a baby. He said that to give you a real future, a life of stability and success, I had to let you go. He arranged for your adoption by a good family, a family with a name that could open doors. He promised me you would be safe, that you would be powerful, and that you would never know the shame of your mother, the failed artist. Every word was a lie, my love, a lie designed to steal my inheritance and my son in one fell swoop. This dress, this is the gown I wore on my last opening night, the night I discovered I was pregnant with you. It is the only thing I have left that holds all the joy I ever knew. Isabel has kept it for me. For you, she hid this letter, and your true name inside it, a final, desperate prayer. that one day the truth might find its way home. Know that not a day has gone by that I have not loved you. You are the best thing I ever did. You are the song that was silenced, but I pray that one day you will find your own voice. Forever yours, Ilara. The letter slipped from his numb fingers. He stared at the birth certificate, at the dress, at the photograph. The pieces of his life, a life he thought he knew. A life built on the cold, hard foundation of his own ambition, rearranged themselves into a new and monstrous picture. The founder of the theatre was his grandfather. The forgotten actress was his mother. And he, Julian Croft, was not the clever investor who had bought a failing asset. He was the rightful heir, the dispossessed son who had just spent the last month planning with ruthless efficiency to bulldoze his own mother's heart and soul into a pile of rubble. He stumbled backward away from the table, away from the dress that was his only link to a life he'd never known. He hit a rack of costumes, sending a cascade of satin and sequins whispering to the floor. He didn't notice. The roaring in his ears was deafening. He sank to his knees on the dusty floor of the workshop, a conqueror brought low, not by an army, but by a single unraveling thread. The truth doesn't break you. It remakes you. For a long time there was no sound in the workshop, but the ragged tear of Julian's breathing and the soft, almost inaudible weeping of Isabel. He remained on his knees, the letter and the birth certificate, lying on the floor before him, like the wreckage of a life he had dismantled without ever knowing he'd lived it. The cold, hard certainty that had been the bedrock of his existence had been pulverized into dust. He was not Julian Croft, the self-made titan of industry. He was Julian Croft, the lost son, the unknowing traitor, the ghost haunting his own legacy. Isabel finally moved her joints, creaking softly, as she lowered herself onto a low wooden stool beside him. She did not touch him. She simply sat in the quiet ruin with him, a steadfast lighthouse in the sudden, violent fog of his identity. Outside, a low rumble of distant thunder answered the silence in the room. "Your mother?" She began, her voice a soft, steady thread in the darkness. She wasn't the tragedy Lawrence described. She was the sun this whole place orbited around. When she stepped onto the stage, she didn't just perform. She set the world on fire. Julian listened, his gaze fixed on the emerald dress. It seemed to shimmer in the dim light, no longer an old costume, but a living, breathing entity. "Lawrence came after your grandfather passed," Isabel continued. "He presented himself as a savior. He spoke your grandfather's language, the language of business, of ledgers, of practicalities. Ilara trusted him. She thought he was protecting her father's dream. But he was a poison, a slow, patient poison. Rain began to patter against the high basement windows, a soft, sorrowful drumming. He twisted everything. A sold-out show was a lucky break, but unsustainable. A rave review was sentimental nonsense from critics who don't understand finances. He made her doubt her own talent, her own instincts. He convinced her that her art, the very soul of this place, was a liability. He made her feel small in her own home. He bled the theatre dry behind her back, creating the very financial crisis he then used as a weapon against her. Julian looked up, his eyes hollow. "And me," he whispered. Isabel's face was a mask of grief. You were her greatest joy and her deepest vulnerability. When she told him she was pregnant, he saw his final move. He told her a child would be the end of the theatre, the final nail in the coffin of her career. He told her the world would be cruel to a child raised by a flighty single mother artist. He painted a picture of a life of struggle and failure for you. A flash of lightning illuminated the workshop, casting their faces in stark, momentary relief. The thunder that followed was closer, a deep, angry growl. "He promised her a better life for you, Isabel," said her voice, breaking. "He found your adoptive family. He told her they were powerful, that they could give you everything she couldn't. He made her believe that abandoning you was the greatest act of love a mother could perform. He broke her. He broke her heart, took her theater, and stole her son, all while smiling and telling her it was for her own good." Julian closed his eyes. The image of Lawrence's smug, dismissive face as he'd spoken of Ilara flashed in his mind. Tragic, really. No head for business. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. The architect of his mother's ruin had become his trusted mentor. The man who had orphaned him had raised him in a way, shaping him into the perfect tool for finishing the job. A new feeling began to coalesce in the empty space where his identity had been. It was cold and sharp and clean. It was rage, a rage so pure and profound, it burned away the shock and the grief, leaving behind a diamond-hard resolve. He was no longer the lost son. He was the avenger. He stood up. His movements were steady, precise. He carefully folded his mother's letter and the birth certificate and placed them in the inside pocket of his suit jacket close to his heart. He looked at Isabel, and for the first time, she saw not the arrogant investor or the broken man, but the son of Ilara Vance. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but they held the weight of a lifetime of unspoken gratitude. He turned and walked out of the workshop, up the narrow stairs, and into the grand, empty theatre. The storm was directly overhead now, rain lashing against the windows in furious sheets. The building groaned under the assault of the wind, and the lights flickered, casting the lobby in a strobing, chaotic dance of light and shadow. He found Lawrence standing by the main entrance on the phone, his back to the room. He was laughing. "Yes, the permits are all but signed," Lawrence was saying. "A few sentimental holdouts, but their foundations are weaker than the buildings. By this time next year, we'll be breaking ground on a tower that will actually make money." Julian walked across the marble floor, his footsteps echoing like gunshots in the thunder-filled space. Lawrence turned his smile still on his face as he ended the call. "Julian, there you are. For a moment, I thought you'd let that old woman's ghost stories get to you." Julian stopped a few feet from him. He did not raise his voice. He spoke in a tone that was terrifyingly calm, a quiet, dead center in the heart of the storm. "I know who she was," he said. Lawrence's smile faltered. He tilted his head, feigning confusion. Oh, you mean the actress, Ilara." "Julian, we've been over this. You can't let a pretty face from the past derail $1 billion. Ilara Vance Croft." Julian interrupted the name, a blade in the air between them. "My mother?" The mask did not just slip from Lawrence's face, it evaporated. For a split second, there was a flicker of genuine shock of a carefully laid plan suddenly inexplicably unraveling, but it was replaced almost instantly by something far more horrifying. A slow, creeping smile of pure malevolent amusement. He started to chuckle a low, ugly sound. So Lawrence said, his voice dripping with a mockery he no longer bothered to conceal. The ghost finally decided to speak. "I wondered how long it would take for the truth to find you." The confession was so blatant, so devoid of remorse, that it stunned Julian more than a denial would have. You knew," Julian breathed. "Of course I knew," Lawrence sneered, taking a step closer. The mentor was gone, replaced by the monster that had been hiding in plain sight all along. "I've known since the day I found you. Tracking you down was the easiest part. The hard part was waiting. Waiting for you to grow up to become the ruthless, unsentimental man I needed you to be." He spread his hands, a gesture of mock generosity. And you did not disappoint. You were perfect. You had your grandfather's ambition, but none of your mother's inconvenient soul. You were so eager to prove yourself, so desperate to build your own legacy, you never once thought to look into the one you were trying to destroy. The rain hammered against the great glass doors, the wind howling like a chorus of the damned. This was always the masterpiece, Julian Lawrence whispered, his eyes glittering with a decades-old hatred. Not this glass tower you're so proud of. This, the beautiful tragic irony of it all. I didn't have to lift a finger to tear down Ilara's world. I didn't have to swing a single hammer. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a final venomous hiss. I just had to find her son and hand him the matches. You cannot rebuild a home with broken stones. The morning after the storm, the air in the theatre was scrubbed clean, but the silence was heavier than ever. Julian stood alone on the stage, looking out at the rows of empty seats. He was no longer the man in the charcoal grey suit who had entered through the main gate days ago. The cold, calculating investor had been burned away in the fire of his own history, and from the ashes someone new was emerging. Someone focused, forged in betrayal, and armed with a purpose that was as clear and hard as a diamond. He had spent the night not sleeping but working, surrounded by the theatre's dusty ledgers and his own firm's sophisticated financial software. He had waged a silent, furious war. Guided by the whispers of Isabel and the echoes of his mother's letter, he hunted for the ghost in his own machine. He hunted for Lawrence. The emergency board meeting was convened at 10 o'clock in the same study where Julian had first announced his plans for demolition. The board members, a collection of stern older men in expensive suits, murmured amongst themselves, their faces etched with confusion and concern. Lawrence Hayes entered last, exuding an air of calm authority. He gave Julian a brief, knowing nod, the kind a master gives to a promising but temporarily straying apprentice. He believed the storm had passed. He believed he had won. Julian waited until the doors were closed. He stood at the head of the heavy mahogany table, not in his usual place beside Lawrence, but in the founder's chair, his grandfather's chair. Gentlemen, he began, his voice devoid of its former arrogance, replaced by a quiet, lethal intensity. I have called this meeting to discuss a hostile takeover, not of this theatre, but of this company's integrity. He began not with the letter, not with emotion, but with the cold, hard language he knew they all understood. Numbers. A presentation appeared on the screen behind him. I've spent the last 24 hours conducting a forensic audit of the Majestic's financials, specifically focused on the 3-year period of its decline. He clicked to the next slide. It showed manipulated profit and loss statements, side by side, with the raw data he had unearthed from the theatre's own paper archives. As you can see, revenue streams from touring companies and private events were systematically underreported. Maintenance costs were inflated sometimes by as much as 300% paid out to shell companies that with a little digging trace back to a single holding corporation. Lawrence shifted in his seat, his mask of calm composure tightening almost imperceptibly at the edges. Julian continued, his voice relentless. The result was an artificially created financial crisis designed to devalue this property to make it an irresistible target for acquisition. An acquisition, I might add, that was first proposed to my firm by our most trusted senior advisor. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room before it landed with the force of a physical blow on Lawrence. But this was never just about a piece of real estate, Julian said, his voice softening, becoming more dangerous. It was about a vendetta. He placed the photograph of his mother on the table, then the birth certificate, and finally his mother's letter. He did not read it aloud. He simply let the board members pass it from hand to hand, watching their expressions shift from confusion to shock to dawning horrified understanding. The room was utterly silent, save for the rustle of brittle paper. When the last board member had read it, Julian turned his full attention to the man he had once revered. "You told me to be ruthless, Lawrence, to demolish the past, to build the future." He took a step toward his former mentor. "You taught me that sentimentality has no place on a balance sheet." "You are correct. My sentiment for the mother I never knew, and the legacy you tried to steal from her now, requires a ruthless business decision." Lawrence finally broke. "This is absurd." He blustered, his voice too loud. "The boy is emotional. He's been manipulated by a sentimental old woman." The old woman, Julian countered his voice, like ice is the only person in this organization who has shown an ounce of loyalty to its founding principles. "Unlike you." He looked back at the board. "Gentlemen, this company has a cancer of deceit and greed that has been metastasizing for decades, hiding behind a mask of loyalty. And as you always taught me, Lawrence," he said, turning back one last time, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "one must cut out the cancer to save the patient. You have become our greatest liability." He didn't need to call for a vote. The faces of the board members were a mixture of fury and fear. Fury at Lawrence's betrayal and fear of the scandal he had brought to their doorstep. The chairman, a man with eyes as old as money itself, simply nodded curtly to the security guard standing by the door. Lawrence stared in disbelief as they approached. "You can't do this." He hissed, his face a mask of ugly rage. "I built this firm, I built him. No." Julian said, his voice final. "You built a house of cards on a foundation of lies, and the wind has finally started to blow." As security escorted a sputtering, defeated Lawrence Hayes from the room, Julian felt not triumph, but a vast, aching emptiness. The ghost had been cast out, but the house was still in ruins. His first act as the true heir of the majestic palace was not performed in the boardroom. He walked down the grand staircase into the main lobby, where the entire staff had gathered, their faces filled with uncertainty. Isabel stood at the front, her hands clasped, waiting. Julian stood before them, the man who, days ago, had promised to destroy their home. He looked at their faces, at the fear and the hope and the quiet dignity of people who had dedicated their lives to this place. "The demolition," he said, his voice echoing in the vast space, "is cancelled." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by a wave of stunned, joyful murmurs. "My name is Julian Croft, but my mother's name was Alara Vance. And this theatre was her home. Through a great injustice, it was taken from her and from me." He paused, his gaze finding Isabel's a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "Today we begin the work of bringing it back. We will not be tearing down these walls. We will be restoring them. We will fill this stage with light and music again. We will honor the legacy that was stolen." He looked out at all of them, no longer an investor addressing his employees, but a son addressing his long-lost family. "Welcome home." For the first time in a century, a sound erupted in the lobby of the majestic palace that was not rehearsed applause. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated hope. A new story begins where the old one was silenced. 6 months later, the majestic palace theatre was not a crater of glass and steel, but a hive of careful creation. The scent of demolition dust had been replaced by the clean, sharp smell of fresh paint and wood polish. The angry roar of heavy machinery was gone, its place taken by the focused sounds of artisans at work, the gentle tap of a restorer's hammer, the low hum of a sander, the murmur of voices planning, not plotting. The light that now filled the grand lobby was not the cold, sterile light of an asset being liquidated, but a warm, hopeful glow that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Julian Croft was in the heart of it all. The expensive armor-like suits were gone, relegated to the back of his closet. Today he wore simple dark jeans and a plain grey Henley, a fine layer of sawdust clinging to his sleeves. He was not observing from a detached distance. He was learning. He spent his days with the craftsmen, learning the difference between Rococo and Baroque plasterwork. He spent his evenings in the archives with Isabel, poring over old photographs and playbills, absorbing the history of the place, not as data, but as a family album. One afternoon, he was on a scaffold, with the crew restoring the great proscenium arch, trying to help rehang a heavy velvet curtain. He was clumsy, his movements unaccustomed to the physical logic of the stage. The heavy fabric slipped from his grasp, threatening to billow to the floor. Isabel, watching from below, called up to him, a rare, genuine smile gracing her lips. "Trouble, Mr. Croft," he managed to catch the rope, his face flushed with effort. "It's just Julian, please," he grunted, straining against the weight. And yes, this thing has the temperament of a lead soprano. She chuckled, a warm, rich sound that echoed in the vast space. You can topple a financial empire, but you can't manage a simple curtain. Your mother had the same problem. She always said the scenery had more dramatic timing than the actors. He paused, looking down at her, a real smile touching his own lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The casual mention of his mother no longer brought a jolt of pain, but a flicker of warmth, of connection. He was not just the son of a ghost. He was the son of a woman who had struggled with the same ropes he was holding now. That evening in his grandfather's office, now simply his office, he found something he had missed before. Tucked away in a heavy sea chest was a collection of leather-bound journals, his mother's diaries. For hours he sat and read the city lights beginning to twinkle outside the great window. He met his mother, not in a tragic letter of goodbye, but in the vibrant, messy, passionate scrawl of her daily life. He read about her dreams, her fears, her frustration with a leaky roof in the East Wing, her joy at discovering a new playwright. He found the unfinished scripts. They were brilliant, raw, and full of the heart that Lawrence had so despised. One play in particular captured him. It was a story about a woman who builds a magical lighthouse that captures echoes of the past, allowing people to speak with the ghosts of those they have lost. It was called The Echo's Song. It was unfinished. And in the margins in her looping script, she had written, "For Jay. So you will always know where to find me." The restoration of the majestic palace took another 4 months. On a crisp autumn evening, a year after Julian had first walked through its gate with the intent to destroy it, the theatre was ready. The brass was polished to a brilliant gleam, the velvet seats were a deep, rich crimson, and the great chandelier above the lobby glittered with a clean, fierce light. A new sign was unveiled out front, announcing the grand reopening season. The first show on the bill, The Echo's Song, a new play by Elara Vance. On what would have been the opening night, Julian stood with Isabel in the wings, looking out at the magnificent empty stage. The stage was set for the first act, a simple lighthouse interior. The air was filled with a new kind of silence. Not the silence of decay or abandonment, but the sacred electric hush of possibility, the deep breath a theatre takes before it comes to life. "She would be so proud of you," Julian Isabel said softly, her hand resting on his arm. He looked out at the stage at the single spotlight illuminating its center, and felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. The ghosts were still here, but they were no longer restless. They were home. The ache in his chest, the one that had been there for as long as he could remember, was finally gone. He had spent his life building towers of glass and steel, cold monuments to an ambition that was never truly his. But here in this house of memories and echoes, he had finally built something that mattered. He turned to Isabel, his eyes clear and full of a light she recognized at once. It was Ilara's light. "This isn't an ending," he said, his voice filled with a quiet, certain joy. "It's an opening night." What a powerful journey of uncovering a legacy that was nearly erased. It shows that sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. It simply reveals the cage you've been living in your whole life. Julian was given a chance, not just to reclaim a building, but to rebuild his own soul from the rubble of a lie. He chose to face the ghosts of his past to create a new future. If you were in Julian's shoes, would you have stayed to rebuild the theater, or would you have walked away from the painful memories forever? Let me know your honest thoughts in the comments below. And if you love stories that explore the difficult choices that define the human heart, make sure to subscribe and join our community for the next journey.